You hit on a very important point. If the UN were not there, many foreign policy specialists say that we would have to recreate the UN tomorrow, because you need an international organization to bring the countries of the world together to deal with these problems, albeit not always successfully, but at least try to do it. And there are also so many other services UN provides, such as helping to move aircraft, ships mail weather information around the globe. So there are a lot of practical services under that whole UN umbrella that are very critical. But the UN does have areas where it needs to improve, and we'll talk about some of those in just a moment. Well, you have chronicled a lot of your enthusiasm for the United Nations, and also a large number of the great highlights of your life, which has been, you've got quite a few of them. You have many, many of them in this book, A Life of Leadership from D-Day to Ground Zero, which is a very interesting book. It's a very interesting read, and there are so many things we could talk about in this book that we won't have time to get to today, but let's focus for just a moment on when you were Deputy Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. How did, now this was back in the 80s, mid-80s, but how did the U.S. view the United Nations at the time? We've seen the UN evolve over the years. The UN has improved its internal management. It still has some ways to go, as everybody will agree, but it has improved markedly. But how did the folks at the State Department view, in the United States, view the United Nations in the mid-80s, as opposed to maybe how you view it today, as you look at it from another perspective?
Well, I was unfortunately working for an administration that had a negative attitude towards the United Nations. President Reagan was not very fond of the United Nations, and his staff was even expressing his what they thought to be his wishes, was even more anti-UN. And I regretted that, because I was pro-UN, and I was in a position where I could benefit the UN if only I could get the president to change his mind at least a little bit and begin to favor the UN. One of our big problems at this time was that the United States was not paying its dues, and they thought that they would correct things by simply refusing to pay your dues. Well, you don't become a very popular member of a club if you don't pay your dues to the club. That's should be one of our responsibilities. We're a wealthy nation, and we can well afford to pay our dues to the United Nations, which is a tiny price in relation to our total budget. So I worked with his staff about some issues, and this was at a moment when the non-payment of dues, when other countries saw that we weren't getting away without paying our dues, they sort of stopped paying their dues too, and pretty soon the United Nations, which by its charter is not allowed to borrow money, the United Nations was about to go broke, and by the end of that year they would not have enough money to meet the payroll of their staff. And I thought that was an embarrassing situation and a highly dangerous one, and the United States ought to set a good example and pay up its dues and get off this problem. We certainly didn't want the UN to go broke because the United States didn't pay its dues. So I was left to, the only thing I could think of to do anything was to quietly talk to the president's wife, who was a good friend. And I got an appointment with Nancy and said, "Did you know that your husband is going to finish his 8 years as president by bankrupting the United Nations, and on December 31st it will not be able to pay its dues?" And she said, "No, John," she said, "that couldn't possibly be true." And I proceeded to prove to her that it was true by showing her letters and documents that said that this was going to happen. And she said, "Well, I certainly wouldn't want to see him do that and be responsible for killing the United Nations. That's an awful way to leave his legacy on America. And I don't think he would like it. So let me see what I can do." And so several weeks went by, and I began to be more discouraged every day when I didn't hear anything or see anything. But suddenly I got an invitation to lunch at the White House, and I found that the Secretary General, who also got an invitation to lunch in the same place at the same time, and I thought the president is going to give him a hearing. And so the date came, and the meeting took place, and the Secretary General then was Boutros Ghali's predecessor, the Spanish fellow.
Javier Perez de Cuellar.
Perez de Cuellar. Exactly. And Perez de Cuellar was not an eloquent man. He was a very good Secretary General, but his speaking style was a modest one and not too effective. And I didn't have high hopes for this meeting, but he turned on when it came his turn to speak at this luncheon and to toast the president. There were always mutual toasts. He gave the speech of his life, and it was very emotional, and he confirmed that the UN was on the verge of going bankrupt, and what a terrible tragedy for history that would be for him, and as well as for the president. And he completed the speech and sat down, and the president stood up again. The president had already made his speech of welcome to the Secretary General, but the president stood up again and said, "Mr. Secretary General, I didn't realize it was so serious." And he said, "I certainly do not want to be the nation, and we will do what you've asked. We will announce a program before the end of the year that will repay our dues." And they did. And I felt very elated, and my relationships with his staff people was dropped to about 0 for a while. In fact, one of them called me up the next day and said, "John, you know, the president made a mistake yesterday. He didn't really mean to say what he said." So he said, "It's really not a commitment." And I said, "No, Don," you can imagine who it might have been. "No, Don, I heard it, you heard it, and you know what he said." And so we're both committed by his comments. Mm-hmm. And the president did prepare in his budget for the following year. He did have a plan in which over a 5-year period we would repay our back dues. And early in the next year, I had the great pleasure of taking a very large check. I think it was $63 million, if I remember correctly, in my pocket from Washington to New York, and presenting it to de Cuellar.
Perez de Cuellar, yes.
And he was very pleased, and it was a good photo op for the newspapers and publicity for the UN.
Very, very important moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, and the main purpose of Global Connections Television is to focus attention on international issues that impact people from Frankfort, Kentucky to Frankfurt, Germany, and from Lima, Ohio to Lima, Peru. We also try to take a look at the United Nations and to see what the role of the UN is in dealing with many of these international issues. My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable about the United Nations, the former Deputy Secretary of State for the U.S. during the Ronald Reagan administration, John C. Whitehead. In 1984, retired as co-chairman and senior partner of Goldman Sachs. From 1985 to 1989, Mr. Whitehead served as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State in the President Ronald Reagan's administration. We've been talking about a very interesting story, anecdotal, about the United States and the Reagan administration was not very fond of the United Nations. But just to wrap that up, and I know we could spend the whole program on that. It's such an important point and an important part. But as I recall, at the very end, when President Reagan, maybe right after he had left office, he gave a very important speech, and I believe it was London, if memory serves, and he was very complimentary of the United Nations and was talking about how the UN we needed a United Nations, especially as we moved into the 21st century. So that apparently there may have been a little bit of a shift in the philosophy or the approach towards the United Nations. But I can imagine you were not a very popular fellow with the staff, especially if they were trying to defund the United Nations. But it was a great story.